In this video, I'm going to show how to set the noodler up with the Deluge so that you can sequence Deluge synths using the noodler's sequencer. First of all, let's start with wiring and cables. Have the Deluge connected over a power adapter because we're going to be using it to power an external MIDI device. I have a regular USB type A to B cable here, and I've also got a USB type A to B adapter, which I bought on Amazon. I'll include a link down below. We just attach this to here. Notice I have the Deluge off, and obviously the noodler's off because it's powered by USB. Plug the USB cable in here. Then I power up the Deluge, so it will detect the noodler as a MIDI device already connected. The next thing we need to decide is who is in charge here. Both of these are sequencers, and both of them can send and receive MIDI clock. The Deluge will send and receive MIDI clock over USB, and the noodler is also able to send and receive MIDI clock. So we need to pick one of them to be in charge. In this setup, I will have the Deluge send transport controls and MIDI clock to the noodler, and the noodler will send notes to the Deluge. Let's configure the noodler first. Hit the menu. Now I'm going to go into Settings Menu 1, and this allows me to set the USB channels for each of the four parts, the pad, drone, motif 1 and 2. I've set these to USB 1. Motif 1 is on channel 1, motif 2 on channel 2, pad on 3, drone on 4. The noodler appears as 4 virtual USB devices, but the Deluge will only see the first one. I also want the Deluge to send notes to the noodler, because when the noodler receives notes, it will change the key that is playing, and this allows us to change what's being played. So on channel 15 and 16, we've got keyboard transpose and noodler control. On page 2 of the settings in the noodler, I've adjusted the velocities for the pad and motifs. The default velocity on the Deluge is 64, so if you program in notes into a MIDI sequence, it will default them to 64. You can change that on the Deluge. What I've found is if these velocities are too high, the notes will clip the digital audio circuitry on the Deluge and you'll get distortion. I find it works best if you just turn those down. On page 3 of the settings is one final critical section, which is the clock input. The noodler will need a clock to run its arpeggiators. You can generate that clock internally. I have it set to USB 1. Remember, USB 1 is going to be the USB port here on the Deluge. So the Deluge is going to send the clock to the noodler. Now we've nothing configured right now, but if I hit play on the Deluge, straight away we can see on the noodler screen that it's picking up the clock from the Deluge at 120 BPM. Now we need to map the synths on the Deluge to MIDI channels on the noodler. The noodler has its 4 parts configured for channels 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we need to do MIDI learn onto the Deluge to get these configured. Now, obviously the Deluge will only receive MIDI notes if the noodler is sending them, and the noodler won't send MIDI notes unless it gets a clock from the Deluge. So to get started, we just hit play, and straight away we see that the noodler has got a clock. This is flashing green and red and blue. Then select motif 1 so that motif 1 is sending MIDI notes. Press learn on audition, and we see the pads flash white as usual on the Deluge. And we start getting a lovely pattern playing. Now let's look at how we can change this. Press Shift menu, and in the pattern editor here, I'm on just a pattern I've configured. It's got a length of 10, running at a 1/6 of the clock with various different steps. If we can change the patterns, of course, to get a very different sound. And if I change the divisions, it goes slower on 1/3, faster on 1/8. Well, 1/6 seems just about right. If we click back to the main, I can of course have motif 1 move around if I adjust the position. And we're going to look later on at modulating that using the built-in LFOs. Naturally, while this is playing, I can always adjust synth parameters on the Deluge, because it's just using this as a voice. There's no notes going into the sequencer. Now we know we can change the key on the noodler by pressing the buttons on the front panel, but what if we wanted that to happen automatically? Well, this is where we can create a MIDI channel here on the Deluge and set it to channel 15, which, as you recall from the settings menu, we set the MIDI channel 15 to be the noodler control channel. And if the noodler receives white notes, shall we say white keyboard notes from the piano, it will change the key. So here, if I press C, I get C on the noodler display. If I press D, I move to D. This changes the different chord types and so on. So by simply programming in notes on this MIDI channel, I'm able to adjust the key of the notes being sent by the noodler. So we could do this here at C and then this here at F. And you can hear the notes have changed key, and watch here. The noodler is receiving the MIDI commands back from the Deluge on channel 15 and adjusting the key of the notes being played. And we can take advantage of all of the Deluge's sequencing, so we could even go and program this in on every other pass through the loop, so we could have So now we're combining two very powerful sequences. We're taking advantage of the step sequencing and the probability and conditional notes on the Deluge with the generative capabilities of the noodler. So far we've looked at just using the motifs and controlling the noodler manually. So we can adjust the position, for example, of motif 1 by dialing this knob. Right now our music is static. There's not much variation in the sound coming from the synth engine on the Deluge, and there's not much variation in which notes are being played by these patterns on the noodler. We can of course move them manually, but wouldn't it be great if we could have that done using an LFO? Well, luckily the noodler has 3 LFOs built in. If we press the menu button and press the top right button, you can see here LFO 1, 2 and 3 can be configured to different rates and different shapes. LFO 1 and 2 also have a probability amount which governs whether or not they will generate a value. I'm going to leave LFO 1 and 2 at 100% because we'll just use LFO 3 and 1 for this demo. I'm going to show you first of all how to modulate the motif positions on the noodler using the LFOs, and then we will look at how to use the noodler's LFOs to modulate parameters for the synth engine on the Deluge. First, let's get started. Press menu and press up here to load up the mod matrix. You have 8 mod matrix slots, and I'm going to set mod matrix slot 1 to use LFO 3, which is a 16-beat sine wave, and it's going to modulate motif 1 position. You see the current value of the position right now is 8. This is the center point of that range. So the motif is this long, it'll pick the center point. Let's choose the modulation amount, set it to about 20%, which means the range will be 6 to 10. So if the midpoint is 8, it'll move it by 6 to 10. So if we look here, we see when I hit play, motif 1 starts to move. It'll only move once it gets the clock and the MIDI play from the Deluge. Let's do the same with motif 2 position. I'm going to set it again to about a 20-25% say modulation range, and we'll use that same sine wave. And now when we hit play, you see that both motif 1 and 2 are moving up and down as that sine wave modulates their position. Let's go into mod matrix slot 3 and use the pad position, and we're going to modulate it using a much slower sine wave, a 48 beat sine wave, and we'll set that to be a very small amount because the pad right now is quite large, and so we could also modulate the pad size as well. We went in here, pad range, and the mod source here, we could set that to a sample and hold with a very small modulation amount. And now if we play everything again, we arm the parts. You see the pad and the motifs are all moving, and the pad just got larger there. Now, say you just wanted to stop the modulation, you didn't want the noodler to modulate the parameter for, say, the motifs, you can just press Shift and 1 and 2 there, and you'll see there's little red circles appear around the play pause indicator for motif 1 and 2. This indicates that the modulation is paused. And unpause. Pausing the modulation is useful if you want to just test the effect of modulation. Say we wanted to see the effect of the modulation of the pad. Great, so we now know that we can modulate the internal parameters on the noodler. But could we use the LFO to modulate something else? The Deluge already has 2 LFOs, which obviously you can use, but if they're already assigned to other functions, the noodler has 8 mod matrix slots here, which you can assign LFOs to modulate parameters on the Deluge. Let's modulate the filter frequency using one of the LFO slots on the noodler. I've gone into mod matrix slot 5, and I'm going to use this ramping down LFO, which I've configured. It runs over 5 seconds, it ramps down and then jumps back up to the maximum position, and it's a unipolar. I've set this to be on MIDI CC1. So basically the noodler will generate MIDI CC1, send it out over the USB, and we're going to MIDI learn that onto the Deluge. Very importantly, I've configured it to be on channel 1. Well, the Deluge will just learn that, but more importantly, USB 1, because remember, that's what the Deluge is expecting to find the noodler on. Now, the Deluge won't actually do anything until we actually set up this learning. So let's turn on the LFO and get it modulating. The LFOs, when they send to external MIDI CC values, are free running. You can't pause them. They're always on, unlike the LFOs for the internal parameters, which you can pause. So now this is generating a value in the range of 0 to 25. If we press learn, now the Deluge has learned the modulation coming from the noodler, and as you can see, the frequency is changing. Ramps down to 0 over 5 seconds, and then jumps back up to about 10. Remember, on the Deluge, the range of parameters goes from 0 to 50, and over here the range is 0 to 127. So 25% of the range here would be about 15 or so. If we change the modulation amount to 50% here, we should see this ramp jump up to about 24, 25, which you see there. So now when we hit play, so as you can hear, that synth sound, that just nice patch, it's just changing ever so slightly as we play it. And because we've set it to a 5-second LFO, it's probably out of sync with the rest of the music. So it's going to be different every time through. So these are just some tips of how you can use LFOs on the noodler to create more movement and change in the sounds you're making using the Deluge synth engine. There's a few things I didn't cover in this video. One of them is the fact that the noodler already has a sequencer built in. If we press Shift menu, there is a chord sequencer that you can use to configure the order in which the noodler plays its chords. So you can program these in by dialing through the different sections and arrange progressions from one to the next. you can include repeats down here so that it repeats individual ones. This works well if you have no existing sequencer, but because I already have a sequencer here on the Deluge, for me I always find it easier just to program the notes into the pad on the Deluge and actually have it do the sequencing. Another feature that I didn't cover in this video is the Noodler's MIDI controller. The MIDI controller will let you send manual CC values out to synths, and they're mapped to the standard MIDI settings. For example, volume is on CC7, so we're able to adjust the pad, drone, and motif volumes. If they were on external synths, you could just dial these knobs to adjust the different values. It also lets you adjust the pan using CC10, the filters using 74 and 71, and also for the pad and drone and motifs. So if you have classic synths which have got the standard MIDI mapping for filter settings, pan and volume, this would be very, very useful to just control everything from one place. As far as I can tell, these can't be modulated using the LFOs, but they can be edited, so you can change the CC values and the ranges being sent. So for example, if you have a synth that uses a non-standard filter CC setting, it's easy to set here. While this is a useful feature to have, I don't find it too useful in practice. It's hard sometimes to get the knobs to figure out which one goes to which setting. This here is very sensitive, and so you often jump past where you want to go. If I actually wanted to manually control settings on a synth, I'd probably use a dedicated MIDI controller like my Fader Fox EC4, which pairs up wonderfully with the Deluge. Link to the video where I cover that is up above. I hope you found this video useful, showing the generative capabilities on the Noodler with the synth engine and sequencing on the Deluge. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and leave me comments whether you like the video or not. Thanks for watching.